This is a population density map of Nevada. Looking at it, you'll see that there's really only two heavily populated areas in the state, along the western border with California and in the south around Las Vegas. Everything else is sparsely populated. What you're seeing isn't the typical case of a city versus countryside divide, but rather what makes Nevada unique is how much of this land belongs to the federal government. If we're to look at a map of all federally owned land in Nevada, an insane 86% of the state is owned by federal agencies, or about 57 million acres. But why is this the case? I mean, no other state comes close to this amount of federally owned land. Well, we need to go all the way back to the Civil War, when Nevada was admitted as a state, to understand it. In 1864, the North had finally gained the upper hand against the South, and the Republican Party had a firm grip on the federal government in Washington, D.C. But with the presidency up for grabs, Republicans weren't taking any chances. They rushed through the admission of Nevada, accepting the new state just 8 days before Election Day, ensuring that Abraham Lincoln would get 3 more electoral votes. But it turned out he didn't even need them. With the southern states out, Lincoln carried all but 3 states. But in the rush to get Nevada into the Union, some shortcuts were taken. Ordinarily, a state needed a population of at least 60,000 before it would be admitted. Nevada's was a shade over 40,000. The state didn't have its final borders in place. The southern corner of Nevada, including what would eventually become Las Vegas, was only added later. The state's constitution was the product of a hurried convention in Carson City, and instead of sending a courier with a copy to Washington by rail, they sent it in Morse code by telegram. Though the Nevada Constitution had one important, specific provision that Congress insisted on. They wrote it into the federal act that allowed Nevada to apply for statehood, with a disclaimer on federally owned land. In essence, the state of Nevada agreed up front that the state wouldn't claim title to any of the land within its own borders. All the land that wasn't already claimed would remain federal property. If the delegates at Nevada's state convention had been given more time, they might have rethought that pledge. Most states that had been admitted before didn't have anything like that as part of their state laws. They were free to lay claim to vacant land within their jurisdiction and resell it or develop it on their own. Nevada gave that power up when it was admitted into the Union. Only a handful of states, all in the West, have made this pledge. Why the Congress insisted on these terms isn't entirely clear. Some have speculated that it was intended to clear up disputes over land titles left over from the Mexican-American War, when the United States seized most of the Southwest, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada. If in doubt, the federal government would be the owner. There was also a small but growing lobby for natural conservation. The national park system that we know today wouldn't take off for another 30 years under the administration of President Teddy Roosevelt. But here and there, the federal government was starting to set aside scenic land that would be kept as wilderness. President Lincoln himself signed a bill to preserve land in California that would eventually expand into Yosemite National Park. Another possible explanation was that the federal government wanted to make sure that its preferred practice of homesteading would be carried on in Nevada. The Homestead Acts allowed for vacant land in the West to be broken up into 160 or 320-acre lots that settlers could move into and buy cheaply. This encouraged the creation of small, independent farms, which Northerners in particular preferred over the large plantations that were typically seen in the southern states. Homesteading played a major role in the settling of the Great Plains, and no doubt many Northerners hoped to see the tradition carried on in the West. Slavery probably played a role in their thinking too. Northerners had varying opinions about civil rights, and few were ready to give the descendants of African slaves equal rights. But Northerners had no interest in keeping up the Southern system of plantations covering 1,000 acres worked over by slave labor. The South was on the ropes at this point, but the Confederates weren't beaten, and the fate of slavery was still unsettled. Northern political and economic leaders understandably wanted Nevada broken up into smaller farms, where large-scale slavery would be economically impractical. But the problem was that the smaller farms weren't practical in Nevada either. Nevada is extremely mountainous. Only Alaska has more mountain peaks, believe it or not. It's also the driest state in the Union. No state receives less rainfall per square mile. Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, all were served by homesteading. Nevada's economy would have to go in a very different direction. Farming the usual cash crops in this region of the country, corn, wheat, soybeans, just wasn't feasible in Nevada. What was feasible was ranching, raising cattle, sheep, and hogs. To the extent that was there ever any agriculture in a place like Nevada, it was bound to be all about animals, not plants. The largest cash crop in Nevada is alfalfa, which is used as animal feed and requires an extreme amount of water. A successful ranch takes up a lot more land than the Homestead Acts ever provided for. Cattle have to graze, and that takes up room. An average ranch in the US is over 400 acres, and with its arid climate, a cattle herd in Nevada would need even more room to graze. Nevada also turned out to be rich in minerals, including gold and silver. But miners look at real estate very differently from farmers or ranchers. Miners don't necessarily want to buy land, they're after what's underneath. So instead of turning land over to a steady flow of homesteading farmers, the federal government wound up leasing prospecting and mineral rights to miners and selling a few plots to ranchers. Mining is a hit-or-miss business. A rich vein of ore can be worth a fortune, but there's a lot of promising locations that don't pan out, as they say. Even when you do find valuable minerals, the deposit doesn't always last very long. A vein of gold or silver can be mined out within a few years, making its discoverer rich but leaving employees at the mine looking for work elsewhere. Sometimes towns would spring up around lucrative mines, only to die out when the mine was exhausted. Goldfield, Nevada is probably the most spectacular example of a Nevada boomtown, showing just how precarious Nevada's mining economy could be. In 1902, prospectors found rich gold deposits along the border with California, about 200 miles southeast of Carson City. At the time, Las Vegas hadn't even been settled yet. The aptly named Goldfield quickly became the largest city in Nevada. Gold ore processors moved in as well. By 1906, Goldfield's population was 20,000. The gold didn't exactly run out, but just a few years later, miners had gotten all the easy-to-reach gold. What was left was deeper down, and miners had to struggle with briny subsurface water. That and labor disputes turned most of the gold mines unprofitable. It's been mostly declining ever since. Only 225 people lived there in 2020. But Goldfield isn't going to disappear completely. It serves as the seat of Esmeralda County, one of the smallest counties in the country, with only 730 people. It's also 98% owned by the federal government. Still, the modest courthouse provides an anchor for a small community surrounded by many grand, vacant buildings, like the old high school and the Goldfield Hotel. Oddly enough, the owners of many of these buildings still try to keep them up, apparently thinking that maybe the gold mines will reopen someday. But as Goldfield's history shows, the boom and bust nature of gold and silver mining meant that buying land in Nevada's mining territory was a very risky proposition. Nevada remained sparsely populated for most of its history. It wasn't until the construction of Hoover Dam in the 1930s that the state's largest city, Las Vegas, began to develop into a major metropolis. Large casinos, featuring entertainment by stars of Hollywood and financed by mobsters, became the backbone of the city's economy. Today, the Las Vegas metro area is home to more than two-thirds of Nevada's 3.1 million population. Nevada's second largest metro area, centered on Reno in the west, began its growth at about the same time. Reno's claim to fame was that it was the best place in America to get a speedy divorce, thanks to Nevada's liberal divorce laws and short residency requirements before filing. Hotels and apartments grew specifically to house divorcees, waiting out the 6 weeks needed for them to establish residency and untie the knot. Ironically, the key to populating Nevada turned out not to be farming, ranching, or mining, but gambling, entertainment, and divorce. With farming and homesteading being impractical and the mining economy being so unpredictable, there just wasn't much demand for land in most of Nevada. The federal government wound up keeping the title to nearly all of the state. So what exactly does Washington do with all that real estate? Well, different agencies hold land for different purposes, obviously. Some of it serves as land for conservation and recreation. Nevada is mostly arid semi-desert, broken up by grasses and shrubs, but there is enough rainfall for pine forests in some of the valleys between the mountains. The Toiyabe and Humboldt National Forests hold scattered sections throughout the state, preserving these modest but environmentally important forested areas. Nevada is the home of Great Basin National Park and part of Death Valley National Park. Visitors can roam through Nevada's barren deserts and forested mountains. The terrain is, as you imagine, harsh but beautiful. All that dry, empty, unpopulated land is great for setting off things that go boom, or flying things that might crash, which has made Nevada a prime site for military training and testing. The Army operates a munitions depot at Hawthorne, where it stores weapons for all of the armed forces. The Air Force has two installations, both near Las Vegas. There's Creech Air Base near Indian Springs, about 20 miles northwest of the city, and Nellis Air Force Base, which is right on the northeastern border of Sin City. Finally, the Navy has its own air training base at Fallon, about 50 miles east of Reno. Since 1996, Fallon Naval Air Station has been the home of the Navy's fighter weapons school, better known as Top Gun. With so many fighter trainees attempting dangerous maneuvers and learning to master different missiles, the empty Nevada deserts are an ideal place for this sort of training. But possibly the most spectacular use of federal land in Nevada, or scariest depending on how you look at it, took place at the Nevada Test Range, north of Las Vegas, during the 1950s and early 60s. This was where the federal government tested nuclear weapons. On test days, Las Vegans and tourists could step outside and witness the power of the hydrogen bomb firsthand. It was a memorable sight. The dazzling flash, the powerful explosion, the rising mushroom cloud. They were all at a safe distance from the blast, of course, though later on they risked being exposed to nuclear fallout. Later test treaties required that nuclear tests be set off underground, which made the show a lot less exciting. But most of the federally owned real estate is controlled by the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM for short, which can probably be best described as the Department of Land we don't really know what to do with. They may not hold the really valuable real estate, but BLM really is the big landowner. Out of the 57 million acres of federally owned land in Nevada, the Defense Department only controls 60,000 acres. The National Park Service owns a little less than 800,000 acres. The Fish and Wildlife is the owner of 2.3 million, and the Forest Service has 5.7 million. That leaves the Bureau of Land Management with a crazy 47 million acres of real estate in Nevada alone. BLM is not the most popular outfit in Nevada, or the West in general. They've been accused of mismanaging herds of wild horses, cutting ranchers off from grazing land, and stifling economic development. It's not all BLM's fault though. Congress has given it a conflicting mission of balancing between conservation and usage. Which takes precedence when will depend on the administration, so things are prone to go back and forth a lot. Most of the land is scrubland, desert or near desert with sagebrush scattered here and there. The land isn't necessarily all that valuable for conservation. In terms of economic use, the main value is as grazing land. BLM does make a little money off the land, mainly by granting local ranchers grazing rights. These grazing permits are very important to ranchers in Nevada. Nevada ranchers don't always own a lot of land themselves. Instead, they own a few plots surrounding watering holes and rely on federal grazing permits where their herds can forage for grass. BLM also makes what are known as payments in lieu of taxes, or PILT, to local governments, to make up for the property assessments that counties would get if the land were privately owned. It is possible to have BLM sell off land, but to do that, a private company or individual has to file a petition with BLM to have them arrange an auction, and that process is complicated. Local officials are likely to resist. When the land is sold off, they lose the guaranteed PILT money, so the incentive for would-be landowners to file is weak. You can spend a fair amount of money and time only to see someone else grab that parcel of land you were eyeing. The arrangements leave a lot of people dissatisfied. Ranchers think the grazing fees are too high and grazing restrictions are too tight. Conservationists argue that too many herds are moving into natural habitats. Miners complain that it's difficult to get permits for prospecting and opening mines. Hikers and recreational vehicle enthusiasts want more land set aside for recreation. In the late 1970s, the Jimmy Carter administration attempted to reserve more BLM land for conservation and animal habitat. This set off a flurry of opposition from ranchers and miners that eventually coalesced into the Sagebrush Rebellion. The rebels wanted to have the federal government start selling off parcels of land that could be used for grazing or mining permanently. They went so far as to rebuild dirt roads to foster development in parcels that BLM had designated as wilderness. Federal agents were harassed. The state of Nevada considered passing legislation to free up federal lands, something that it really isn't supposed to do under its own state constitution. Later on, the Reagan administration took the side of the sagebrush rebels. It cancelled the wilderness designations and reopened land for grazing and prospecting. But legislation to sell off federal land stalled in Congress, leaving everyone more or less where they were when it started. One can argue whether it's practical for the federal government to sell all that land off at once. Even if they tried, a lot would still probably go unclaimed. But federal bureaucrats have an incentive to hold onto land longer than they need to. Doing so means that the Bureau of Land Management retains its importance, and they keep their jobs. One part of the state where the BLM is starting to create serious problems is on the outskirts of Las Vegas. The rapidly growing metropolis is bordered in by federal land, and much of that land is controlled by the Bureau. Land for commercial development or for constructing new homes is starting to get scarce. If Las Vegas is going to continue to grow, the Bureau of Land Management will probably need to part with some of its real estate in the next few years. Whether that will actually happen, though, remains to be seen, so who knows what will come next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.